Thank you, Ben, and thank all of you for coming. It's really great. As Ben says, this is my first major outing in Toronto. It's really nice to see some friends that I've already made, and hopefully some ones that I will now make, which is a different kind of making. So I wanted to start off by saying that, of course, we honour and acknowledge the Indigenous lands upon which this event takes place. And then, without too much further ado, I think we're going to move on to this. So what I thought was, this is the launch for Makey is Connecting, but I've been in Toronto for 4 months now, and I'm on Twitter. I've been on Twitter for about 10 years. And the reception I'm getting in Toronto is kind of so-so. And so I thought probably most of the people who follow me on Twitter who are in Toronto are probably in this room. So while you're here, I thought we could maybe go through some of the tweets and help you to understand what's going on. Okay, so there's Twitter. So you see, first of all, sometimes this bit is, that's me on Twitter. If you want to tweet at me during this, that'd be fine and welcome, and would show that you're starting to get the hang of Twitter. This one, right, for example, this was last night. This was the launch of the new Fashion Studies journal. Give that a round of applause. Launched by Ben and Alison David, and a bunch of really interesting speakers. That's quite a serious kind of tweet. I'm celebrating the launch of this journal, and that was a really good thing. And we got 28 likes for that, so that's good. So you got the right kind of idea there. But as you know, Twitter is also used for quite mundane kind of things. So like this was some biscuits recently. Because I was meeting some PhD students, and I went into Metro opposite the Rogers Communication Centre to look for some suitable biscuits. And I found these, which in my country are called jammy dodgers, and they're quite a low form of biscuit. And here I noticed that you call them fruit creme. Fancy. Flip the box over. Crème de fruit. Even more fancy. But you see that one got 2 likes. By the time I flipped the box, 2. I thought maybe, we're not really communicating cultural differences. You might not understand what I'm saying. So this is why I'm going through a few of these. This is Duckman. You've seen him on Dundas Square. I see some nods for Duckman. TK, he's otherwise known as. He does this. He plays bucket drums and plays whistles. It's a very delightful sound, bringing happiness to all of Toronto. I thought you'd all agree. 6 likes. It's not really good enough, is it? We're going to have to work together on this. Let's see what else. So there's his happy face. He's always very pleased. He was really pleased with the tweet as well. He tweeted me a bunch of smiling chickens, which was good. This was when the Ryerson did this headline that said, "International student recruitment equals big bucks for RU, a display of naked greed." I said, the phrase you're looking for is opportunity to build a diverse community of learners. Which I thought was probably my best one of the year, but 12 likes. From people who are not here, other people. And so this was I went to a talk by Mark Banks, who's from the University of Leicester, and I grew up in Leicester in England. So I pretended to be somebody who goes to events purely for their Leicester-based content, and noted that it was a really good talk, but criticised him for his lack of references to Leicester's famous orange cheese, iconic clock tower, or the playwright Joe Orton. 6 likes. Somebody actually came up to me after that and said, "Do you really go to Leicester-based talks for the Leicester-based content?" I said, "No." Obvious. That was that there. I think probably finally, just to get you warmed up in the spirit of these things, this was a thing I often find in Canada, where I hear about something interesting in Canada and I think, oh, I must go there. Because in the UK, you hear about something interesting in like Wales or something, and it's a short drive. So I heard about the Banff Centre. I've even heard of the Banff Centre before, and I heard again about the Banff Centre. Oh, that sounds like a really good place. How far's that? And the answer is 27 days walking, or 34 hours in a car. And again, being from the UK, we think that a 2-hour drive is like quite a long way. Are we there yet? 34 is pushing it a bit. But I also like the fact that Google highlighted that the hazards include, not those hazards, no. Google did not detect those. Google noted that the hazards included ferries, weather, and Americans. Which, so I thought that was sufficiently entertaining, but only 9 of you did. So that's Twitter, you see, that's how we've been working it. I'll talk a bit about Twitter and the possible dark side of Twitter in a little bit. But what I'm really meant to be talking about whilst you're all here is the launch of Making is Connecting. So Making is Connecting is a book that I did the first edition of in 2011 when it looked like that. And then it seemed to find an audience amongst a bunch of people that I hadn't necessarily anticipated, though I had hoped for. Though the flaw in my scheme was revealed to me when I went into Foyle's, when that was first published, I went into Foyle's bookshop, which is a big bookshop in London where I thought there'd be a quite good chance of seeing it on a shelf, which would be nice. And I went in and literally, I still remember walking into the bookshop, and it was only at that moment that I realised I had no idea where in the bookshop it was meant to be. And if I didn't know, that was probably bad news for everybody else. Because I kind of thought it should definitely be in the craft section, should definitely be in the media studies section, because I'm kind of from media studies. It should definitely be in some kind of, it should be in sociology, I would also think. They also had a corner which was for kind of it had Make magazine and those kind of make books for makers, basically. I definitely thought it should have been there. Obviously, I'm not actually so egotistical that I really think it should be in 8 different places in the shop, but I didn't know which of the places it should be in. So that was the potential downside, but maybe due to electronic media and Amazon and things, that it did manage to find an audience amongst craft people, musicians, coders, people that like the maker movement, all these different kinds of people, which was nice. It was better than I might have hoped for, so that was good. So they wanted me to do a second edition. Which I did, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the differences between then and now as we go along. At that launch last night for the Fashion Studies Journal, which I seem to keep mentioning, so that's quite good promotion for you. At the launch of the excellent Fashion Studies Journal, open access, go online now, you can subscribe straight away and just get it all free. All of the speakers were telling really nice stories about how they came to be where they are, kind of thing, and I thought, oh, that's good. So I should ask myself this question: why did you want to write this book? And then I have to think about what the answer is. The answer is to do with wanting to make a case for the importance of creativity, which kind of sounds not difficult, because everybody basically thinks that creativity and making are nice things, don't they? Nobody's opposed to it. But I guess it's not necessarily seen as being important or a thing of great social consequence as such. It's more like the icing on the cake of society rather than the real most substantial thing. And that does lead us on to some of my basic points. My first point is about the centrality of creativity, how it's absolutely vital for society. And the easiest way for me to remember this point is by saying not just a nice thing. It's obviously creativity and making are nice things. That is true. It's nice when people make things. It's nice when you make something and show it to somebody else. It's nice, that's good. But it's not just nice. I think it's absolutely vital for the health and well-being of a society that we have people around and about, all of us, feeling able to make and share things, having a voice, being able to share a thing you made with somebody else and feel that nice moment of connection, the sort of element of sort of gift giving where you get to see a thing I've made and you feel pleased, and I get to see something you've made and you feel pleased. We can exchange ideas and actual things, and that's all really nice. But I've used the word nice again, you see, and it's not just nice, it's really important. Part of my motivation for wanting to make that point, I suppose, is because I worked, maybe still to some extent work, but certainly then I worked in a department which was all about serious sounding media issues. You know, people who are studying media policy, media regulation and things like that, which sound like proper subjects, don't they? And meanwhile, I was interested in somebody makes a song and puts it on YouTube. This guy knits a scarf. and it's sufficiently impressive that 3 of his friends like the scarf and want to knit their own. Little things like that, which sound basically banal on their own, don't they? But when those things add up and you've got thousands or millions of people engaged in those kind of activities, then I think it's really important and vital and good for society. So it is a thing of, I would say, you know, equivalent value to the more serious sounding kind of social and political topics you can think of. So I wanted to make that point. I kind of borrowed from John Ruskin, one of the founders of the arts and crafts movement, and William Morris, the sort of moral argument that it's not only nice, but it's absolutely vital that people should have these opportunities to be creative, and without that, well, then society is like a tree that is unfertilized, unwatered, and will wither and die. You really need to have these opportunities. Also, in my string of resuscitated old thinkers, I took from Ivan Illich, the sort of 1970s radical philosopher, the idea that it's absolutely vital to be able to make your own world, and by this I mean media worlds and the physical environment in which you live, that you can make your mark on it, that you can show your own stuff in it, you can make it your own, you can reflect your identity within it. I think that's, again, absolutely vital for us all. The worst situation is the situation we were kind of in at the end of the 20th century, where you've just got people consuming media made by other people. And that media may be perfectly good and entertaining and everything, there's nothing wrong with any of it. There's something wrong with some of it. There's mostly, you know, it's all fine and good stuff, it's perfectly entertaining, it's perfectly well made and everything, but it's not giving people the opportunity to express their voices and to reflect elements of themselves. It's made by a sort of distant elite with lots of gatekeepers. Last point on this was that I wanted to talk about inspiration, which doesn't seem to get talked about that much for whatever reason. Maybe it's hard to say that much about. But I think the real importance of people being able to express their voices and then inspire others is really important, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. So, the kinds of making that I'm interested in are not just digital and internet things. I kind of have a background in talking about digital and internet things, and I think the internet can be a great amplifier of those things. But people have been making their mark and expressing themselves for thousands of years, many thousands of years, and all of these different forms of making are just as vital as each other and of any other ones that you can think of. Even making a difference in the world, making relationships, that broader sense of making as well. This particular picture is to remind me of the nice point that I got from Rosika Parker, who's a sort of 1970s, 1980s feminist who wrote a book called The Subversive Stitch about embroidery in women's lives historically. Which you might, you know, it's not the most obvious thing to connect with YouTube and digital media and all of that, but she argued that embroidery was for women on the one hand a marker of femininity, that's what it was and is, but at the same time she describes it as a weapon of resistance against the ideas that are associated with that, because she says that through making embroideries and being engaged in embroidery, well then women get a sense of agency, acceptability and potency. So you've got agency, I can make a thing. Acceptability, I make this thing and share it in a community of others who sort of like and respect it. And potency, the real, I've put this thing into the world, it didn't exist before and I've made it and now there's this new thing in the world. That sort of sense of really bringing something new into the world. And you can apply those ideas to all of the stuff that I would be talking about today and all these different kinds of media. In the second edition, I've talked more about music, because for some reason in the first edition I didn't really think about music. I was thinking more about physical objects and digital media, I think. And obviously music can involve both of those things. But I stirred in music more partly because I was trying to make music myself, and then the experience of that feeds into some of the things in the book. So I'll say a little bit about that in a minute as well. The internet is the sort of connecting tissue in the sort of modern way in which all this plays out, though, of course. And I like to make the point that the internet is still amazing, because the thing that endeared the internet to many of us 10 or 20 years ago, the very straightforward, obvious thing that it would mean that as a person who's passionate about X, then you didn't have to just show your interest in this thing to the small number of local people around you, most of whom had no interest in that thing and wondered when you were going to stop doing it. And instead, you could find all the other people in the world who are interested in X, whatever X is, and share your passions and engage in conversations and inspire each other, build ideas together and all of that. And you can still do that. That is still absolutely what you can do with the internet. But these days, of course, in 2018, compared to even 2011, we feel more gloomy about that, don't we? This is from the Pew Research's Internet Division, I guess, a couple of days ago, where, to a smallish extent, the number of people who think that the internet is a good thing has gone down a bit, a good thing for society that's gone down a bit. The number of people who think it's a bad thing has also slightly gone down. But they're posing this question about, is the internet a good thing or a bad thing? And maybe we're starting to feel a bit more queasy about that. But also, of course, asking people, is the internet a good thing or a bad thing, is a really stupid question anyway. Because it's kind of like, are people a good thing or a bad thing? Because the internet is so huge and massive and includes everything and it's reflections of us. So if you're going to say, is the internet a good or bad thing, you might as well say, are people a good or bad thing? And you're like, well, taken all together, then people have some things that are not so great, and also I quite like people. People are good, you know. What can you possibly say? Individually, we mostly find them to be quite nice, but collectively, maybe they're up to no good. It's just not really possible to generalise about it, I would think. But there is that feeling now that we've got stuff to worry about. That was the good or bad. In particular, with those social media services, which are great for amplifying the kind of creativity I'm talking about, we're all aware these days of the downside of that, in particular the ways in which, of course, Facebook and other services like Twitter are hoovering up massive amounts of data from you purely to sell that to advertisers who then deliver closely targeted adverts to you. And obviously that seems problematic because of the massive amount of surveillance there. I think Facebook's basically the worst for that. And I deleted Facebook. And then I went on Twitter to say that I deleted Facebook. And obviously then you get people going, but you're still on Twitter, aren't you? But I was able to say, I've been on Twitter for 10 years. And for example, I was reading this article that was in The Guardian about how social media services like Twitter are now able to get so much data that you've voluntarily given yourself, and they can put it together with other data with forensic precision. They can work out exactly what kind of stuff you want to see. You've read that kind of thing. So obviously I felt troubled by this, and I closed the Guardian app and went onto the Twitter app in order to complain about this. And the Twitter app showed me an advert for a golf tournament. I've got no interest in golf. And 2 days later, it showed me an advert for WrestleMania. WrestleMania. And I have never in my life shown any interest in wrestling or any wrestling-related products, sports, or anything else. So I think that I'm basically okay with Twitter, if only because of its complete incompetence. Facebook's too good, that's why it's scary. Nevertheless, we can still go back to the point. That sounded like terrible for the internet, but it's not terrible for the internet. The internet is still amazing at doing all the things that we can do with it, and you don't need to be using particular services. There's, some services you can avoid, you can use other ones and so on, or just use the internet itself in very direct ways with, anybody can set up a website kind of thing. You don't need to be using those social media platforms which hoover up so much data about you if you don't want to. Internet still does many great things. Other parts of what I wanted to talk about were about how, particularly amplified by the internet, we can create a culture is made by us. In the past, as I said before, when you had a culture that was mostly created by faceless other people somewhere else, you could maybe aspire to become one of those people, but mostly we weren't those people, and they were making stuff which we were able to consume. But the fact that now we can create that culture and share it amongst ourselves, that is really good. That's a really strong point for internet culture in general. And I like the fact that we can hopefully increase diversity in media and in making more generally, because the tools are now in our hands. This is the optimistic version of what we can do with the internet again. And in particular, it's part of my role as a Canada Research Chair. One of the things I promised to them that I was going to do was to talk about diversifying how we think about making. Because, again, in 2018, we're at a point where quite a lot of people know what the maker movement is. There's a kind of idea about makers. There's makers in the world making things. But often it seems to be about men making drones and robots and Arduino boards, doing stuff with Arduino, all of which, electronic kind of things basically, all of which can be really inspiring and clever and good. There's nothing wrong with any of that. There's no particular reason why making should suddenly have congealed around electronic technology projects. I don't get why that's happened really. I went to the New York Maker Faire in 2014, I think, and they call it the World Maker Faire, and it gets lots of people from lots of different places. And what's really nice about that is that you've got a lot of different kinds of people, from craft to technology to all different kinds of making, basically. And they all identify as makers, and that's why they're there. They're identified with the idea of makers and making, and they've gone there. And they have a shared identity as makers, even though they're doing radically different things from each other. And that seemed nice. And in the same year, I went to a European one that was in Rome, that was billed as the first European Maker Faire. And for some reason, that was just like a technology fair, and it was every single booth was a technology stand, basically. I thought, well, it's not meant to be like this. They've got the wrong idea in Europe for some reason. I think we should encourage and foster the broadest possible collectives and communities of diverse kinds of making, and diverse kinds of people being involved in it, obviously. This is about inspiration again. I sort of have a thought about how we can talk about inspiration, which is kind of borrowing from an idea in educational psychology where they talk about scaffolding, and the idea there is that, I think this is right, correct me if I'm wrong, educationalists, that like there's stuff you know and stuff you don't know, and with scaffolding somebody can help you sort of build up your knowledge from this space into this space into this space, so you eventually fill up the area where you don't know about stuff by supportively building up scaffolding around it. And I think for inspiration you can have this idea that we can scaffold inspiration where this person over here makes a thing, and this person over here, they don't want to make that thing necessarily, and they may or may not think that thing's good, or they may or may not want to make that kind of thing, but because that person's made a thing and put it out there and had the courage to show it to other people and to share it and be public about it, then they think, oh, well, I could do this thing and show this thing. So they do that, and then somebody else sees that, it's like, oh, well, if you've done that, I suppose I could do this. And it kind of builds up and up and up in a really nice way. That's when people are online being kind and supportive to each other, which they mostly are, but there's particular kinds of online community that you can foster where people are more supportive and kind, and there's other ones that tend to be more combative. And again, in the book, I talk about what are the characteristics of some of those kind of environments. There's also a point to make about how we can talk about individuals and communities together, that I thought was worth mentioning here. I think the idea of making is connecting people seem to like it, who like to talk about collaboration and communities. There was a strong kind of interest in community engagement, community craft, that kind of thing. And also people talking about collaboration, which these days is talked a lot by business people as being like the amazing discovery that you can collaborate with people and it's really, really good. And all of that is true and fine, but when people just talk to me about, oh, you're interested in collaboration, aren't you? When they get excited about collaboration, I think it's a bit of a shame if we lose the magic of creative individuals, because that is the most vital thing at the heart of all of this, is creative people with exciting, quirky, strange, experimental, whatever ideas, which they then bring into a broader conversation, and that is great. The great things do happen when they're in collaborations and when they're talking to other people and when they're forming communities. That is all absolutely vital, but also you need to preserve the magic of individual people being creative, and so I think it's well worth thinking about fostering collaborations, yes, but also how do we foster and build up the individual magic of individual people. Along here, heading towards the end of this talky bit, I mentioned before that in the second edition I'm talking more about music, which I hadn't really talked about before. I'm not exactly focusing on the process of making music or anything very particular about music, but music seems to speak to lots of things in Making is Connecting, because it's about It's about a shared kind of language in a way. It's about building a community of fans if you're a maker of music. It's about it's importantly about the digital sphere, you know, the challenges faced by musicians today where they can't make any money from music because it can be shared so freely online. Then you have to work out other ways to make music. There's all kind of different cross-cutting dimensions where music comes into play. And also, as I said, I've been trying to make electronic music, not necessarily successfully, but I enjoy the process. I was going to say, I don't know if anybody else does, but basically I don't even play it to anybody else, so they're relieved of that responsibility of having to pretend to be interested. But I used to do oil painting. That was a thing that I did as a sort of creative outlet 10 or 15 years ago. And the thing about oil painting, I don't know if you know, but the specific thing about oil paint, as opposed to any other kind of paint, is that it just stays smushy for a really, really long time and takes ages to dry. So the process of painting with oil paint is absolutely about pushing material around on a canvas, trying to achieve the effect that you may have had in your mind, insofar as you had anything in your mind in the first place. And I found that making music ended up being a really, really similar experience of smushing material around, trying to achieve a pleasing effect based on a sort of idea that you half-consciously had in your mind in the first place. So I thought it was a curious parallel between those things. And I've got 3 points I wanted to make that are music-related here. So this is from a book by Michael Bracewell, who wrote The Hours, which is it became a film that you might have seen, but also he wrote a book about Roxy music, and this is from his book about Roxy music. I've got no particular interest in Roxy music, but I like Brian Eno, who was in Roxy music, and this is a really well-written book. And I like this bit. So this is a bit which is right at the start of the book, where he's explaining that basically the bunch of people in this book comprises a set who chose to inhabit the point where fine art and the avant-garde met the vivacity of pop and fashion as an almost elemental force within modern society and culture, and who were eager to work with the potential of both. It's the elemental force bit that I especially like. I don't even know what that means, I don't think. I don't know if he does either. But it sounds really exciting, speaking about like the crucible of pop music, fashion. It's all about culture and how we can make a difference in the world by making things. At least that's what it means to me. And this is how I used to feel about pop music in the 1980s, which was a point when all kinds of weird and wonderful things seemed to be coming out, and it hadn't become too kind of corporate. Before then, that corporate world later on collapsed, and so things have kind of become more experimental again. But that idea that disruptive, surprising little bits of art could come out that you could just buy or consume, and that sort of changed how you thought about things or changed how you looked at things, that was always really exciting. And I liked valuing that and thinking of that as a socially important thing, that with music you could really challenge how people think about stuff or just look at their everyday lives. So I like that bit, and I've also picked out this. So this was from in 2016. I was in a workshop about the creative process, and I built a thing to represent me trying to make music. And you've got the black, I'll go to there. You've got the black spiral and the gold spiral intertwined, because it's a spiral kind of process, but building upwards, up is good in the world of metaphor. I said, this is my process of music making. I really like it, which is the gold. It's often really frustrating, which is the black. But in the end, gold wins at the top. And there's that kind of thing about process. So I really enjoy the process, even if I don't do anything within any of the outputs, which I don't. And then that connects with this book called Musicking, which I didn't know about till really recently, and it was mentioned to me by somebody. I thought it was an intriguing title. It came out in 1989 by Christopher Small. Christopher Small does this interesting thing in the book called Musicking, where he talks about music through the whole book just as a thing that people do. That's why he has to use the word musicking. Because on page 2, he announces that music doesn't exist, which is a surprising fact, disappointing when you thought that you enjoyed music, and music's quite good. But he says that music doesn't exist because it's just kind of abstraction. It's a word that we use for something that isn't really real. Like if I say I'm going to give you some music, I might be meaning I'm going to give you a music score, Or I might be going to give you some old artifact, like a record or a tape, which contains some music recorded on it, if you've got the means to play that thing, or a USB stick. Or I'm just going to download, I'm going to send a file to you, which is a sort of carrier of music, but that's not music either. As soon as you try and pin down really what music is in a really, really clear way, it sort of dissolves in your fingers, which is odd. But his thing there is to talk about music just as a thing that is done by people, and he takes a surprisingly broad approach to it, so that he seems to have a sort of traditional, old sort of approach to music, though he does talk about more modern forms. But when he's talking about concert halls and like an opera being put on, then he includes the cleaner that cleans the concert hall, and he includes the person that sells the tickets as part of this process of musicking, the broadest possible experience that brings music from one bunch of humans to an individual, I suppose. And that discipline of thinking about creative activity just as the act of doing it and not as the product. He doesn't talk about the product at all, he just talks about the act of doing it in forensic detail. And it's interesting to think of your own creative practice like that, not thinking at all about what you end up with, just thinking about the process of doing it. And as somebody who does music where the process is the only interesting part of it, then I like that kind of point. So, I wanted to end up on this bit by saying, trying to be optimistic, say that we can still do everything. All of those things which we imagined we could do with the internet and digital media 20 or 25 years ago, we can still do all of those things. We may nowadays know disappointing things about particular platforms run by particular companies, but that doesn't mean that we have to give up on all of that. And any of the other creative potential things that we could ever have done, we can still do all of that, and we can do more of that, and we can think of new ways to use the internet to do that as well, or to amplify that and to help us to make connections between people and to do more. Nearly last, I wanted to just share with you this nice quote, which is from the book called Why We Make Things and Why It Matters by Peter Korn, who's a furniture maker. And in this kind of memoir about his journey through furniture making and what he eventually realized about what it meant to him. And he ends up somewhere near the end saying this. So this is the one bit where I'm going to try and read out a quote to you without falling off the stage. The critical point, as I began to see it, was that all people who engage in creative, self-expressive work, visual artists, craftspeople, writers, composers, and others, participate in the same essential human activity as a woodworker does at the drawing board and at the bench. None of us enter our studios because the world desperately requires another painting or symphony or chair. But none of us take the work lightly either, because it requires too much commitment, discipline, and risk of failure. I like that. We engage in the creative process to become more of whom we'd like to be, and just as important, to discover more of whom we might become. We may make things because we enjoy the process, but our underlying intent, inevitably, is self-transformation. I like that, making that connection between making as a thing that you do, and then the sort of self-transformation that comes from that. And I like the thing as well about how, like, the world wouldn't end if you didn't make a thing, but the process of making a thing brings with it all kind of values, enables you to make connections with others, brings forth all kinds of positive stuff that comes from the process of making a thing, whatever that thing may be. And we can still do all of that. And that's the main point that I wanted to make here today. Thank you.